I'm very excited about this event, not only because I happen to have family in Atlanta, but because I'm a big fan of everybody that's involved in this program. That is artists Suzanne Jackson, Yanique Norman, Katya Tepper, Erin Jane Nelson, and the organization Burnaway, all based in Georgia. Erin's work happens to be included in the KADIST International Art Collection, and the collection is generally a starting point or a jumping off point for all sorts of programs and exhibitions that we organize in collaborations with other people and organizations in the US and abroad. And, you know, with all eyes on the state of Georgia during this last totally miserable election cycle, I found myself paying closer attention not only to relevant pundits and pollsters in the state, but to Burnaway, which is a dynamic online magazine based in Atlanta, which Erin directs alongside a great team when she's not in the studio. And I didn't go to Burnaway, pardon me, I didn't go to Burnaway for political coverage, but instead to learn more about what artists were doing, making, and thinking about during this unbelievable time. I mean, in a way, it's all sort of political coverage, but you know, since the demise of alternative weekly newspapers in major cities around the country, arts and culture coverage has really taken a hit. And Burnaway, with its focus on contemporary artists based in the American South, not only fills a great need in the region, serving those artists in that community, but plays a critical role in letting the rest of us know what's going on. And so in that way, it serves us. So I reached out to Erin, and we put this program together to hear directly from artists in the state of Georgia about their lives and practices and what it might mean to live and work where they do. I'm really grateful to the artists, Suzanne, Yanique, and Katya, who Erin will introduce in a moment for their participation. And I'm grateful to Erin for her time and her vision and really putting this thing together with me. So I'll introduce her and Burnaway and quickly hand it over to Erin. Thanks again for coming, and we'll leave some time at the end for questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. So we do want to hear from you directly, so be stewing on it as these brilliant people are talking. Anyway, Erin Jane Nelson attended Cooper Union School in New York, and her work has made it back to that city recently, featured in two great shows, both at the Whitney Museum of American Art, one Making Knowing, Craft in Art, 1950 to 2019, and a show called Between the Waters. Her work was also included in Otherworldly at the Frieze Museum in Leeuwarden and Photography Today, Public-Private Relations at Pinakothek in Modern in Munich. She's had solo exhibitions at Atlanta Contemporary Art Center, Chapter Gallery in New York, and Document in Chicago. She is a 2020 recipient of the Rabkin Award for Arts Journalism and a 2021 MoCA Georgia Working Artist Project Fellow. She's been at the helm of Burnaway since 2018. Burnaway is an Atlanta-based artist-run organization with 3 core programs: a magazine of contemporary art and criticism, career training for aspiring arts writers and cultural journalists, and advocacy for artists and writers working in the Southern United States. Since 2008, the organization has brought vital, critical dialogue to one of the most politically polarized, historically fraught, ecologically threatened, and economically disadvantaged parts of the country. From Appalachia to Miami, Nashville to New Orleans, Burnaway both documents and participates in the vibrant cultural landscape of the region and continues to wonder, what is the South? I wish that everyone could applaud and we could bring Erin to the stage, but alas, in your heart, please help me welcome Erin Jane Nelson to this program right now. Thanks.
Hey everyone, thank you Jordan for that lovely introduction. My name is Erin Jane Nelson. As Jordan said, I'm an artist and I also am the director of Burnaway. I am a white woman with red hair and glasses, and I'm sitting in front of an artist designed Zoom background that I got from the New York Art Book Fair by Eric Say Connection. I'm so pleased to convene this group of artists. Selfishly, they are some of my favorites working in the region. And I think all 3 share an approach to making things that's very engaged with big ideas like art history and theory and poetry. But they all work in a way that's extremely maximal, materially rich and generous. And they've all each developed a kind of idiosyncratic technique to make their work, something that they and only they do. Hello, everybody. All right, so we have a couple of individual questions and some group questions. And my first individual question is to Suzanne. One of the recent articles about your work that I really loved talked about this funny reversal in your career trajectory where many artists of your generation, especially women, have seemed to just be now getting long overdue recognition for work that they made decades ago. But on the flip side, you are very actively making some of the best and most ambitious work of your life right now, and are also getting much undue attention, or overdue attention, excuse me. And I'm curious to hear, as an artist, we're often thinking, we have to follow this traditional career path. We go to graduate school and we just keep building, body of work after body of work. And I think that your story is really interesting because you make these pivots from gallerist to dancer to set designer and then back to art again. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those circuitous paths. And I know particularly our San Francisco audience is probably curious about your time in the Bay Area.
It's quite fascinating to me because people think that I've switched back and forth. I've never considered myself a gallerist. That's an interesting term that I know is proper, but I have been an artist who simply, within my community of artists, because we were not mainstream, as we were not considered mainstream, we simply worked together to put exhibitions together. I have always been a painter since I was a baby. I never stopped. When I was a dancer, I was also a painter. When I paint, I write poetry, I move, I live, I eat, and it's all the same to me. I think that whole idea of art is life, life is art, has been very important to me throughout. And it's just culturally also a part of who I am. I have lived I was born in the middle of the United States in St. Louis, and my parents moved before I was a year old to San Francisco. So I saw artworks and beauty in San Francisco first. Then we moved to Alaska and I grew up there. And of course, in magnificence of nature. And that's just overwhelmingly been a part of my life and still is. And each place that I have moved in the States, to Los Angeles, or back to San Francisco, to Los Angeles. And in between, as a dancer, I was on tour of Mexico, South America. That was a great experience, culturally learning other places and also being recognized as an artist in South America. We were recognized as artists and considered very important people on tour. Coming back to the States, we then become these creatures who inhabit strange spaces and play with materials. And in my generation, we did not expect originally to get an MFA. We expected that we would finish our liberal arts education or no education at all. I was basically self-taught. So even going to college, we were in a period of time that was pretty independent. We were working with each other, helping each other out if we made big canvases. Our professors came in the beginning, middle, end of the year, so that when I left college, I auditioned and ended up going on tour in South America, ended up in Los Angeles, took a class with Charles White because everybody said, you've got to study with this instructor. And actually, Charles White was the first Black instructor that I'd ever had in any of my studies. Or I had one social science professor in the college. So in a sense, he was a mentor, but there were also mentors like Samela Lewis, Elizabeth Catlett, who just sort of mentored us along the way in Los Angeles, all of us as artists. And I just did not know any better. I didn't know that they separated people into color or women artists. I just knew that I was going to be an artist. And I probably coming from outside of the States, that orientation of doing the best that you can with what you do and what you know. And if you're really good at it, you receive recognition for it. I've just been persistent and determined in everything that I do. So moving from place to place, I now realize I have been following the paths of ancestors. And since I've moved to Georgia, I have learned more about my history, who I am, my family. It's a very strange thing. I would never have expected to be in Georgia at all. And here I am with my final 15th studio space, which I love. Yeah.
15th time is the charm, as they say.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So my next question is for Katya. And one of the things I've always loved about your work is whenever you talk about it in this incredibly unflinching way, and you dive into really personal topics and autobiographical parts of your life. And yet your work reads as quite abstract and, sort of materially driven. And I'm wondering how you're squaring that, the way that you're making work with conversations around illness and queerness and other aspects of your personal history.
Yeah, thank you. I'll do a quick visual description too. I'm a gender neutral white person with short light brown hair, and I'm sitting in a smallish room. There's a sculpture remnant on the wall behind me. And yeah, so I guess I'll start with the queerness thing, because that's kind of a nice story where I was making work that just was really queer way before I realized that I was. So in that sense, making a material and abstract, like studio-based practice, was just helpful in a certain self-discovery. I mean, and a kind of solid example is I was using plungers. Like I made a sculpture that had like 20 something plungers in it. And I was thinking of them for their connotations with scatological, with plumbing as infrastructure. But I was also using them in this kind of psychosexual way where the like phallic element was really exaggerated, but also the like breast-like element. And I was thinking of it as this really interchangeable, fluid gender signifier. And then a few months later, I was like, oh, I'm non-binary, duh. So that's a nice moment of the art serving the life. With the way I've kind of had like public engagement around disability, I'd say it's mostly so that when other disabled or chronically ill people are viewing my work, they know that I'm not just stylizing the like paraphernalia of illness because I think it's cool or shocking. I'm actually like, if you've had to take medicated enemas, you know that it's like a real hurdle to get your insurance to cover it. And it's not just a like shock value material. So I think I've just wanted to make sure that my audience knows that I'm not just trying to like milk something for an aesthetic instead of for a politic, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think that the abstraction in the work really came also before I had language around something that was hard to talk about, or that I didn't, like nothing in my life had given me enough tools to talk about it until I found community. And over the last few years, I've like my disability, or at least chronic illness for me, is a process of constant changing, and like the rupture that I think everyone is experiencing with the pandemic because of illness, like, is just a constantly unfolding part of chronic illness. So I change a lot and my work changes a lot, and there's always a new paradigm. So now I'm not really making what I would call abstract or material work. And I mean, I have like a 70-page manuscript in progress right now. So I would say this is, in a way, dealing a lot more directly and still with the themes described, but also still very maximalist in content, and still, it's not abstract, but it's highly fragmented.
Yeah, everything that you said makes sense. Thank you. Yanique, next one is for you. One thing I've always really wondered about your work is, your collages are centered around core found photographs. And I was wondering a little bit if you could give a little bit of background to where you're finding your imagery, and also talk about if you've ever made photographs as part of your own work.
Okay, so I have a little bit of a not trying to make it a long story, but my work, I was known for my surrealist drawings, but my job, I work at IMC, which is a Georgia Instructional Materials Center, and in my job, we rely heavily on prison labor to produce Braille books. So my job, we get federal money to provide Braille books and different materials to kids who are disabled and what have you. And so just being part of that kind of environment, that I didn't realize at the time, but it affected me really that much. And then there was a moment working in the job for a few years, my managers actually commissioned me to do portraits of the inmates, and I wanted to sort of like really capture their inner psychology. But when you're entering into the prison and absorb, you couldn't carry a camera, so all of I had to sort of by memory and what have you. And so in going through that kind of experience, I ended up incorporating mock shots as part of my drawing practice. So in 2017, I actually was able to collect about 500 mock shots from various Georgia prison database at one time. And I have since then and now have been using that archive that I got from 2017 as how I'm getting my images. Now it's a little bit more difficult now to actually access those mock shots. I don't know if there's a law or what have you, but at that time it was just like a really sweet time for me to get those public source images when I'm working on that. So while I using these mock shots as a way to sort of kind of warm up my drawing practice, that this was also towards the end of the ending of the Obama presidency and the beginning of Trump. And so for me at the time, I was already trying to sort of like deconstruct my drawing practice, like unravel my drawing practice. And I also at that time, I wanted to sort of like really try to understand the aesthetics of power. And so like the photograph, it was like an immediate sort of way to sort of like handle these sort of really complex ideas about in terms of the institution of like what power is. And especially during this time, there were these other conversations about like the impact, the legacy of Michelle Obama. And like working in the studio, things sort of collide. I had a collage, a mugshot landing on I was collecting these archival images of first ladies, and one day a mugshot ended up on top of a first lady of these images I was collecting, and I thought the juxtaposition was really interesting. And so thus that was my beginning in terms of like really going into the collage. So like for me, in terms of like because I came from a surrealist sort of background, when I'm trying to kind of cultivate my images, it was all fantasy, was all from my own imagination. So for me, at this particular point in terms of my studio practice, relying on existing imagery to sort of kind of like to investigate certain ideas, it was really important for me, being principally a drawer, to make sure that while I am cultivating these images that are already exist in the world, that I have my surrealist, my hand is on that. There's a fantastical element on it. So that was how I kind of began this whole photography. And at first, Erin, I thought at the time when I was doing it, it was more of like a simple exercise, a simple sort of like exercise, drawing exercise, and like just trying to figure out work. And then the work grew. People were interested when curators came in the studio. They're like, oh, this is really interesting. Let me, could you do something this for me? And then it just kind of grew. And then, I've been, doing this work for the past couple of years. So, so that was the beginning, a long, long sort of kind of story.
That's super. Like, I had no idea that that relationship between kind of your day job and finding images in that way. All right, so we're going to transition over to group questions now, and you can all weigh in. You don't have to weigh in. I'll assign it to one of you to kick it off. But one of the first things that I think about when I think about all of your work is the really unique places that you make it. I've seen all of the studio buildings and homes that your work is made in. And I recently moved from kind of being in a traditional art studio in a kind of post-industrial building that fits, our norm of what we think of as where artists work. And I've recently moved into my home, and it's definitely changed my practice. And I think a lot of artists in Georgia are working out of less traditional types of spaces. And so I was wondering if you could each briefly talk about your workspace and if it feels different than from other places that you've lived. And I'm going to kick it off with Suzanne.
Well, I mentioned this is my 15th studio. My early studios at home, of course, were in the kitchen table or wherever I could find a space. My very first professional studio was underground, under a Victorian house in Los Angeles, in kind of a storefront with a little door that was like a rabbit hole, Alice in Wonderland hole to go in to the basement with a dirt floor, $40 a month. That was great. The next space was a house on a hill next to Elysian Park. And then I found the space where Gallery 32 happened in the Granada buildings. Excuse my voice, I've suddenly had allergy hit me just before we started the program. And my favorite studio of all was a 5,000 square foot space that was absolutely fabulous for almost no rent at all. And we had to move from that building, and all of the 16 artists in that building moved downtown Los Angeles. And so the art scene you see now in Los Angeles, where all the museums are, really started when we had to move out of that big loft building. And there's a long story with that, with the man who owned it. His wife met in a concentration camp when they were young, and he had to sell the building in order to save her life because she had heart problems. And we weren't quick enough to buy the building. We should have. Then my studios, from moving around, moving to San Francisco, I had a studio in the Hunters Point shipyard. And that was, for me, was sort of special because that's where my dad worked as an electrician during World War II. So I thought that was great, but I never got to use the studio because I had to work in order to pay for it. And then I started working as a scenic costume designer, traveling all over the country, working on planes and trains and wherever I could roll out and draw. This is my 15th studio. I had a studio downtown when I first moved to Savannah in a wonderful old building that actually was a funeral home originally. And that was a live workspace. This building, I was helping someone else try to find a space to live. And this is what's called a double house. So it's a 3-story building with, comparable to about 18 huge rooms. And my studio, the primary studio, is on the first floor. And like a chain of beads on a necklace, the rooms move from the front to the back. But then I have spaces upstairs on the 2nd and 3rd floor. I have about 3 offices here just because I'm archiving. Well, I have about 60 years of professional stuff that, we're having to archive now. And I'm also restoring this building. I now own the building. So I'm hoping that when I'm gone, this building can be used as artist space as well. And it has a wonderful garden and yard. It's in the Starline Arts District. The neighborhood has changed. So basically, I'm the artist in the midst with all the trees and backyard and a nature reserve. And all the birds come through here. So my work feeds from the pieces of restoration that are left over. I can't throw things away. I don't want to put things into the environment. Paint, I recycle. I let the paint dry, put it back into the work. So I'm always saving parts and pieces from this building, which has made my work not only painting, but sculpture at the same time. So this environment has really helped. When I moved to Savannah, I thought I'd still be working figuratively, but somehow my work just changed because of light and space and also the history and culture here. It's culture shock when you move from the West to the South, even if you've lived all over the country. It's amazing. And the history now especially is just phenomenal to me here in Georgia.
Anyone else? Yanique, I know you're also in a very interesting studio building here in Atlanta.
I am. So my studio is actually a physical church. It was built in 1929, and so the studios are actually the clergy, the office of the clergy, because they had like this really, it was on the very back end of the building, and so they converted all those offices into studios. And the thing that is really interesting about my space is the acoustics. It's a church, so I mean, sound is so amazing. And at the time when I moved into the studio, there was an actual church that was there, was a tenant. And so on Sundays, you can hear them singing, and it was so beautiful because you could hear it through the walls. I mean, it's just like amazing. And then in addition to that, we also have musicians as our other tenants. And so that in the beginning, that was very interesting as visual artists, the visual artists against musicians in terms of trying to find like a quiet time. But when they're rehearsing, you can hear it, just the sound emanates throughout the piece. And if you're playing your music too loud or what have you, it just sound, the acoustics wherever you are in the building, it's just really beautiful, right? And really you could hear those echoes. And in terms of like, this was actually not my first professional, but my second professional studio space. And what was different, the difference between my first and this current one was the space. I had all these walls, I had like these natural light, because all the studios have like, some of them have wraparound windows. And so there's like these really big lights that kind of flood in the natural light. And so for me, in terms of how my work has been impacted by that is in two ways. First of all, the size. I had more space to work. So literally my work grew from just doing like these 14 inches, 8 inches kind of drawing to now like 50 feet, where literally I'm outgrowing the space. I'm like making these collages so big that I'm making them in sections in order for them to actually fit within the space. And I think it's really tied into my obsession with monumentality, grandeur, and corporality. And if now that I'm thinking about that in terms of like the whole like church theology, and also with my Black fungibility in terms of making space and physical presence. I mean, that's part of like, in terms of like my Black fungibility, it's really a complex enterprise of both air and land. And it's like for me trying to figure out ways how to mutate, how Blackness can biologically mutate to fit any kind of space and presence. And so like me being in a space that is like really large impacts the work in that kind of way. And also going back to the whole sound element, my work now is veering into sound, where for the Atlanta Biennial, that my current show that is up right now, I actually experimented with sound, where I was kind of creating like a sonic environment where I was collaging different sounds on top of each other to sort of kind of create, again, the psychological body that I'm also trying to cultivate within my my collages. So like, I guess my space, and that's also part of being like the fungal, is that it's very responsive, it's very sensitive to its environment. And now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, okay, so I am, the work is literally responding to where I am in this very subconscious sort of kind of way. So yeah.
Should I take that, or are we short on time?
If you'd like to.
I'll just say like quickly that I haven't like lived in a big city since I was like 22, so 11 or 12 years. And that, so so I'm trying to say a couple things that like my work has a lot to do with landscape and non-urban spaces, and my studio, well, I guess I would just say that it's been like highly domestic, and that's had a lot to do with disability and illness. And like, even when I was making monumentally scaled work, a lot of it was made in modular pieces that I was like sewing by hand on a couch, like reclining, and just doing that a lot in order to make like 12-foot sculptures. But yeah, I'll keep it brief.
Thank you. Cool. So I'm going to do one more question, and then we will open it up to Q&As for the interest of time. So I'd say that my experience of living in Atlanta has always required building communities that have extended far beyond just other artists my age and the immediate vicinity. And this feels different than, say, friends or peers of mine who are in bigger art centers with huge arts communities, just in terms of numbers. And I was wondering to what degree you guys have built alternative systems of support and community in your respective cities. The first thing that came to mind was obviously, Suzanne, that you're involved with a jazz radio show in Savannah.
Actually, we call it African American classical music, also known as jazz, because jazz is not a nice word, but it's blues, and it's what's fascinating here is that so many of us artists, especially in my generation, have been influenced. We cannot work without the music. The music comes from us, spiritually, culturally, it's within us. And it comes in the work, with the work, along with the work. I was teaching, and the students surprised me because they were listening. I thought they would be listening only to heavy metal or something like that, but they were actually listening to the music from their grandparents when I was teaching at SCAD. So people were influenced by this music, American music, blues, rhythm and blues, Coltrane, Miles Davis. So when I stopped teaching, just being also a part of community. So each place that I've lived in Los Angeles, our large community of artists, it wasn't large, it was small. And it was in segments around the city of Los Angeles, according to where you lived. Here in Savannah, I feel as if some of the students who graduated are still in the community. And I was speaking of that just a while ago earlier, that some of the students have more gray hair than I have because they've been here for a long time, but supporting one another. The radio program happened because I attended in Jerome Meadows' studio. He had studio space and gallery space. And so he would invite artists to show their work. Barbara McCullough came from California to show her films. And through that, her film was on Horace Tapscott. Mr. Ike Carter was there. He's the voice of Savannah State Radio. Everyone knows him for blues and so-called jazz. So we all decided to get together. Tom Vandervan, who is a photographer, engineer, sound engineer. Carla Curran is a professor of marine science, plays the bass. Jerome's a sculptor. We have a couple of other people who are musicians, photographers. So we got together to do this music discussion group, and it overlaps with visual art, with the music, with life in the city, activities that happen in the community. Mr. Carter was surprised. He didn't realize that so many people in the city listen to his music that he plays, the blues, jazz, to that station, because we are, basically Savannah is a city full of creative people of all kinds, even creative thinkers. So people think and create by listening to the radio, listening to the music, and that spiritual essence feeds us all here. And I'm a little unhappy right now. My Bose player that played 6 at a time broke down and can't play CDs anymore. So I've got hundreds of them. So I'm improvising all these ways of listening to the radio, because music, even listening to sound from outside, the birds, I hear them in the morning, listen, even the wind really influences my work and everything that I do. Every place that I've lived, it's about listening and even the silence. So we overlap with our music group. Hasn't met since COVID, but the programs that we were doing from 2013 we've been replaying them, and they're always fresh. It's amazing to me. Music is that thing that keeps us going. It's an essence. And I think any kind of music, all kinds of music, is very important for our spiritual nature. It's the sound we came here with. And we're going to go out with it too.
Katya?
Sure, yeah. I would say that I've had like 2 different kinds of community, and one has existed in this kind of space, like a remote space, for like way preceding the pandemic, where I've been networked with other people like working through disability justice and illness, and even people that lived in the same city still like using Zoom as a way to make things accessible. But and then in terms of like really finding my people in Athens, I'd say that that's happened more in organizing spaces for the most part. But I am really excited about something that my friend and fellow Burnaway contributor, Mo Costello, is cooking up here that would involve a kind of project space in the Georgia Flea Market, which is a trip if you've ever been there. It's a collision of a lot of different, it's a collision space. And I think what they're thinking through seems really interesting to me, because it's really site specific. And I think there's a tendency in I think there's a tendency for art groups outside of big cities to make Instagram geared spaces, and I think I'm really invested in doing things in Athens that are not for other places, or like that are at least Georgia specific. So yeah.
Yanique, did you have anything that you wanted to weigh in on before we head into Q&A?
Yes, I mean, for me, my network, I've always had like, networks outside of Atlanta, coming from SIC, graduating from SAIC, I still connect with that community, in terms of my colleagues and what have you. But since the pandemic, I think since the pandemic, my work, I've been connected to like fake communities or remote communities. And it's really based off the work. So it's not really for me, but for the work itself. And so I've subscribed to like the Metropolitan Opera as a way to kind of like, understand sound and see how like sound is kind of incorporated, because I'm, investigating that more within the work. I've also subscribed to tons of YouTube channels, especially Black women who talk about femininity in a very sort of either lighthearted kind of way, like really superficial, and also in a very deep kind of way, because I'm just, again, investigating that part of it. And just attending a lot of like Zoom artist talks, especially like the Brooklyn Rail, for instance. I've been really faithful in attending their daily lunch hour meetings, because you have like just a rich array of all kinds of artists and creatives that I've never, I'm not familiar with. But yeah, it's like this, I think it's just a mixture of both fake and real communities that sort of allowing me to sort of kind of like better, where I feel more grounded, outside of just the whole, Atlanta kind of scene.
Yeah. All right. There's two questions in the Q&A. One of them I find very interesting. I'm very curious to hear what you guys say. So an anonymous attendee asked if you feel like there are stereotypes that you have to push back against as an artist working in the South. Stereotypes about Southern life, about, I don't know, Southern identity. I'll let you guys weigh in.
I think for me, not expecting to come to live in the South, I thought I'd be living in New Mexico or someplace eventually, in the middle of the country. My coming here, I think I was confronted by the come heres and the been heres. And the come heres always want to help and uplift and help to make things better. We get here. I had the experience of, by accident, becoming president of the neighborhood association, which I couldn't believe happened to me. But it was also a way of getting to know the people in the community by participating. It was really difficult to do because I was teaching at SCAD full time as well. But it was by participating in the community and the neighborhood, I really did get to know more about how people live and what the history, but also had a really incredible experience of, at that time, Carol Green, who was an art historian, curator, was living here before he passed away. So I was able to assist Carol with some research I had done in the 70s that had to do with the South, and never realizing I would be here in the place where that research actually came from. It was about Black African retentions in the Americas. I now have an attitude about people who come here and are kind of pushy. culturally and don't understand the culture as well as they should. I've been in, I was in Maryland for 2 years before coming to Savannah from 94. And so I've been in the South since 1994. And I understand really the difference of coming from cosmopolitan California, New York, seeing all cultures of people. And then my feeling for a long time here was everything was either Black or white. And there is not that mixture of culture, of different kinds of cultures and people from the islands, unless you get, and then you move to Florida and you get to Florida and you've got a mixture of people from everywhere speaking other languages. So I think that was something for me, missing all the variety of languages and different kinds of people, but then learning the intricacies of, I say, two cultures that are here in the South, Black and white, and also the interplay has been really quite fascinating for me. Did I answer the question? I hope.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like I can speak to this sort of just because I'm enrolled in like a northern institution for grad school, and my parents are from other countries, but I'm from Florida. I've lived in New York briefly, for college, and then ended up having to move back to Florida. And I hadn't really, only when I was maybe 20 started to really realize making the drive from Florida to New York that there was this chunk of place that I wanted to deal with more. Anyway, I guess I'm just trying to say that I think that being in this northern institution, I think there's a lot of denial and discomfort, especially in what I would just call white liberal spaces, just really confronting the totality of American history, including how white supremacy is not solely located in the South. And so I think I was really nervous always to even mention that I live in Georgia when all of my peers were New York based. But I sort of feel like the reality check is coming for them that that's not necessarily the best model for dealing with this country. So no, I'll leave it there. Yeah.
And can I just I want to kind of piggyback on what Katya was saying. For me, I didn't realize, maybe because when I came to this country, I lived in New York, and then coming to Atlanta, and just basically my adult years was here, and I found art here. So when I went to graduate school, and everybody there were, again, either from California or from New York or some parts of the world. And so when you say, oh, you're from Atlanta, they're like, Georgia, what is that? So you feel as if you were really backward. And I think for me, subconsciously, I wanted to make sure, and it was and that space was very highly conceptual, and they were really really highly experimental. So for me, I wanted to kind of fight against that stereotype, that in terms of backwardness, this idea of and of course, being a Black woman who is doing the figural or working with the body, and that some people sort of kind of saying that that's kind of antiquated. So I wanted to find, I really wanted to sort of to really push my conceptual sort of roots, really find how can I able to kind of create an ideology that where people cannot pigeonhole me, oh, because you're from the South, or because you're Black, or because you're a woman, you have to create this kind of work. or the expectations of what I'm supposed to be creating. So it was for me sort of like, because of those stereotypes, I wanted to make sure that
I think Yanique is having some connectivity issues, but I'll just, I think what she's speaking to is something that, you know, I can definitely attest to as someone who runs a publication and deals with so many different Southern artists, is that I think there's this assumption of the South, you know, particularly in past lives where I dealt with so-called folk and self-taught art, that there are kind of legitimate forms of training and illegitimate forms, and legitimate spaces for artists and illegitimate spaces. And I think the South, more so than just being one or the other, complicates and builds on the fact that like many things can exist at the same time. Something can be self-taught and expert, someone can be highly educated and also figuring it out. And that is what has been really, I think, fascinating for me to interface with artists in the region, is that some artists are totally fine with leaning into the dumb Southerner stereotype and love kind of playing with the white trash or playing with the, you know, backwoods sort of stereotype. And others, I think, are articulating spaces that can exist between just those sort of black and white ideas of what is or isn't important in the art world. I think more so than any other region, I've lived in the Midwest, the West, the North. I think the South is just very fascinating. I think everyone is kind of always creating their own ways of being in nice ways. Yeah, well, unless any of the panelists have anything else to add, I feel like we're at a really good stopping point for the evening. And I just wanted to thank everyone for tuning in. Great crowd, great panelists. It's a shame that we can't all be in a room together. Yeah, but I think within the times of COVID, this has felt very intimate and lovely, and I'm just very appreciative to everyone. So thank you so much for tuning in, and have a great evening.